she watched a human rip an apex predator into chunks like nothing. The jungle canopy of Tanis 7 filtered light in shades of amber and rust, turning the air itself into something thick enough to taste. Ethan Kovac crouched in the undergrowth, sweat rolling down his temples and into his beard as he recorded atmospheric readings on his datapad. The harvesting station should have been 2 kilometers northeast, but he'd found nothing except overgrown equipment and blood dried black on metal housing. 3 days since anyone had responded to hails, 6 hours since his shuttle dropped him at the perimeter. He wiped his palm against his thigh and glanced at the ridgeline above. Something was watching him. He'd felt it for the past hour, a weight between his shoulder blades that made the hair on his neck stand up. His fingers found the handle of the field knife strapped to his belt, though he knew it would be useless against most of Tanis 7's predators. The attack came from the side. A ridge stalker exploded from the ferns, all 6 limbs and serrated bone plating, moving with the speed of something that had evolved to kill faster than prey could scream. Ethan threw himself backward, his pack tearing loose as claws ripped through the straps. He hit the ground rolling, came up with the knife extended, and saw the creature pivot with impossible grace for something that weighed 300 kilos. His heart slammed against his ribs. The stalker's head split vertically to reveal rows of teeth like broken glass. Then a figure dropped from the canopy between them. She moved like water given purpose, her body a blur of crimson skin and black hair as she drove a blade through the stalker's neck joint with surgical efficiency. The creature convulsed, its death shriek cutting through the humid air, and collapsed in a spray of dark blood that spattered across her legs. Ethan pushed himself upright, breathing hard, and stared. She stood over the corpse, weapon still embedded in cooling flesh, and turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright green, luminous against red skin, marked with darker patterns that traced her cheekbones and jaw. 2 black horns curved back from her temples, catching the filtered sunlight. She was tall, easily matching his height, with shoulders that suggested strength and hands that held the blade like it was an extension of her body. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice carried a musical quality beneath the words, like harmonics layered under speech. Xenobiologist Ethan managed, gesturing vaguely toward his scattered equipment. Dr. Ethan Kovac, investigating the station's silence. She pulled her blade free with a wet sound that made him wince. Her gaze moved over him in assessment, pausing on the tattoos visible beneath his rolled sleeves, the breadth of his chest, the way his hands had automatically shifted into a defensive stance when she'd moved. "Kethrin Scout Soral," she said, "you're the human they sent. That a problem? Humans don't survive Tanis 7 without powered armor." She wiped the blade clean on the stalker's hide with practiced efficiency. "Your species lacks the necessary physical adaptation." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard variations of that assessment his entire career, usually delivered with more politeness. He bent to retrieve his datapad, checking for damage, and missed the way her eyes tracked the movement of his shoulders. "I've been managing," he said, "for 6 hours." She sheathed the blade and started walking toward the ridge, her stride long and purposeful. "The station is destroyed. The workers are dead. You should return to your shuttle." "Not until I know what happened." She stopped and looked back at him, her expression unreadable. In the dappled light, her skin seemed to shift through shades of crimson and burgundy, darker patterns rippling like emotion made visible. He'd read about Kethrin physiology, but seeing it in person was different. "The harvesting equipment disrupted a breeding ground," she said. "The predators responded. There's nothing to investigate." "Then why are you here?" Her lips pressed together, the first crack in her composed exterior. "Confirmation." "Of what?" "That human technology creates more problems than it solves." Ethan felt heat rise in his chest, but before he could respond, the ground trembled. Both of them froze. The vibration came again, rhythmic and heavy, accompanied by a sound like stone scraping stone. Soral's hand went to her blade, her entire body shifting into readiness. "Run," she said quietly. "What is it?" "Ridge stalkers hunt in packs." She turned toward the sound, muscles coiling beneath red skin. "That was the scout. The rest are coming." Ethan grabbed his pack and followed as she sprinted toward higher ground, his boots pounding dirt as branches whipped past his face. Behind them, the forest erupted with movement, multiple bodies crashing through undergrowth with predatory focus. He risked a glance back and saw 3 stalkers closing the distance, their bone plating gleaming like armor. Soral reached an outcropping and turned, positioning herself between Ethan and the approaching pack. Her blade sang free again, catching light along its edge. He saw the set of her shoulders, the way she balanced her weight, and understood she was preparing to hold them off while he escaped. "Get to higher ground," she commanded. Instead, he moved beside her, dropping his pack and pulling the knife from his belt. It looked pathetic compared to her weapon, compared to the creatures bearing down on them, but his hand was steady and his breathing had evened into something cold and focused. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "What does it look like?" The first stalker lunged. Soral met it with precision that spoke of years of training, her blade finding gaps in armor that shouldn't have existed, but the other 2 split and flanked. Ethan saw the one on the right orient towards Soral's exposed side and moved without thinking. He hit the stalker at full speed, his shoulder driving into its midsection with enough force to knock it sideways. It twisted, faster than physics should allow, and its forelimbs raked across his chest, tearing through his shirt and drawing blood. Pain flared white-hot, but he grabbed the nearest limb and held on, using his weight to drag the creature off balance. Its jaws snapped inches from his face, breath hot and rank. Ethan drove his knife into the joint, where its skull met its spine, found resistance, and pushed harder. The blade sank deep. The stalker's death throes nearly took him with it, but he rolled clear and came up gasping. Soral stood frozen, her blade halfway through the second stalker's throat. She stared at him, at the blood running down his chest, at the corpse cooling at his feet. Her skin had shifted to deep burgundy, darker patterns standing out in stark relief. "You killed it," she said. "Yeah." Ethan pressed his hand against the claw marks, feeling warmth between his fingers. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline crash imminent. "You said run. I didn't like that plan." She moved toward him with sudden urgency, her fingers hovering over his injuries without touching. Her eyes were wide, green bright against red skin, and when she spoke, her voice carried undertones he couldn't interpret. "Humans don't do that." "Do what?" "Fight." She looked up at him, something raw and unguarded in her expression. "Not like that, not without armor or weapons or—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "You tore it apart with your hands." Ethan looked down at his bloodied knuckles, at the knife he'd dropped somewhere in the chaos. His chest hurt and his heart hadn't stopped racing. But beneath the pain was the same feeling he always got after violence, a kind of sick relief mixed with shame. "It was coming for you," he said simply. Soral's hand finally made contact, her fingers resting against his shoulder with surprising gentleness. Her skin was warm, warmer than human skin, and where she touched him, he felt a faint vibration, like a second heartbeat. "I need to reassess," she said quietly. "Reassess what?" She met his eyes, and he saw something shift behind the green, calculation giving way to confusion, discipline cracking just enough to reveal curiosity beneath. "Everything I thought I knew about your species." Soral's field kit was more sophisticated than anything Ethan had seen in civilian xenobiology. She worked in silence, her fingers moving across his chest wounds with clinical precision, though he noticed the way her jaw tightened when he flinched. The medical gel she applied burned cold against torn skin, then numbed to nothing. "Hold still," she said. They'd retreated to a cave system she knew, something carved into the ridge by water or time or both. The entrance was narrow enough to defend, deep enough to provide shelter. Outside, the jungle had gone quiet in that way that meant predators were close. Soral sealed the last wound and sat back on her heels, studying her work. Blood still stained his chest and arms, mixing with dirt and sweat. Her gaze lingered on the geometric tattoos that wound across his shoulders, patterns that disappeared beneath the torn edges of his shirt. "These markings," she said, gesturing toward the ink, "they signify rank?" "No, just art." He pulled his ruined shirt off completely, too shredded to be useful. Got them over the years, places I've been, things I've seen. Her eyes tracked the movement of muscles beneath marked skin, the breadth of his torso, the way his hands moved when he spoke. She looked away quickly, focusing on repacking her kit with unnecessary attention to detail. You shouldn't have engaged, she said. It was tactically unsound. It was going to kill you. I've fought ridgestalkers before. Not 3 at once. She made a sound that might have been disagreement or concession, hard to tell. Her skin had returned to its normal crimson, darker patterns settled into stillness, but he'd seen the way it shifted colors during the fight. Burgundy when she'd been surprised, deeper still when she'd touched him. Your people teach you to fight like that, she asked. Ethan leaned back against stone, feeling the cool surface against his spine. His chest ached despite the medical gel, and exhaustion was creeping in at the edges. Outside, something screamed in the distance, cut off abruptly. Some of us learn, he said. Humanity's got a complicated relationship with violence. We're good at it, too good historically, started a lot of wars before we figured out how to mostly stop. Yet you became a scientist. Because I wanted to understand things instead of destroying them. He met her eyes across the small space. Doesn't mean I forgot how. Saral's expression shifted, something almost like approval crossing her features before discipline smoothed it away. She moved to the cave entrance, scanning the jungle beyond with a warrior's vigilance. The setting sun turned the canopy into bronze and shadow, light catching the curve of her horns. The station workers were killed by something modified, she said. The wounds don't match natural predator patterns. Someone engineered the attack. Ethan pushed himself upright, ignoring the pull of healing tissue. Why? That's what I was sent to determine. She glanced back at him. Kethryn interests on Tanis 7 overlap with human harvesting rights. My superiors suspected sabotage. And now? Now I think it's more than territorial disputes. Her hand rested on her blade hilt, a gesture he was beginning to recognize as unconscious. The predators moved with coordination, pack tactics, but refined, directed. Someone's weaponizing the local fauna. Yes. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to order his thoughts past the fatigue. My mentor, Dr. Silva, sent me because she suspected ecological disruption. But if someone's actively modifying predators... He trailed off, following the logic to its ugly conclusion. That's a violation of about 15 treaties. Treaties humans wrote. Treaties everyone signed. He stood, moving to join her at the entrance. Up close, he could see the fine details of her features, the way her darker markings traced elegant lines, the slight point to her ears, the intelligence in those green eyes. This isn't a human versus Kethryn problem. This is someone using both our species as cover for something worse. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, a gesture so slight he almost missed it. We should investigate together, she said. Thought you said humans were too fragile for Tanis 7. Her lips curved, not quite a smile but close. I'm reassessing, remember? Lie. They moved through the jungle at twilight, when the predator's vision was strongest, but thermal signatures blurred. Saral led with the confidence of someone who'd mapped every tree and ravine, while Ethan followed with the careful attention of someone who knew he was one mistake from death. She moved like water, like wind, like something that belonged here. He moved like earth, solid, deliberate, occasionally too loud. You're favoring your left side, she observed without turning around. Your medical gel works fast. Not that fast. She paused, waiting for him to catch up. When he did, she reached out and pressed her fingers against his ribs, feeling for damage beneath healed skin. Her touch was warm, direct, professional. He felt his breath catch and hoped she didn't notice. Bruised, she said, not broken. I'll manage. You keep saying that. Her hand lingered a moment longer than necessary before she withdrew. Your species' tolerance for pain is higher than documented. Maybe your documentation's incomplete. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of curiosity that went beyond tactical assessment. She turned away before he could identify it fully. They found the facility an hour later, hidden beneath the canopy in a clearing that had been carved deliberately from the jungle. Prefabricated structures, military-grade camouflage, and enough power signatures to light a small city. Ethan crouched beside Soral at the perimeter, watching armed guards patrol with weapons that looked Kethran in design but human in manufacture. "This is wrong," she whispered, her voice carrying undertones of something darker than anger. "Those are my people's weapons, but the facility construction is human." "Partnership," Ethan said grimly. "Someone from both sides working together." "To do what?" Movement near the main building answered the question. A transport cage rolled past on automated tracks, and inside were 3 ridge stalkers, each one fitted with neural implants that gleamed silver against bone plating. The creatures moved in perfect synchronization, their natural aggression channeled into something cold and directed. "They're making soldiers," Ethan breathed. Soral's hand found his wrist, her grip tight enough to bruise. Her skin had shifted through crimson to burgundy to something almost black, colors bleeding across her arms and neck. When she spoke, her voice vibrated with barely contained fury. "This is an abomination." Before he could respond, before he could think beyond the sick feeling in his gut, the facility alarms shrieked to life. Lights blazed across the clearing, turning night into artificial day. Guards converged on their position with military precision. They'd been detected. Soral pulled him into motion, running for the tree line, but armed figures were already cutting off their escape routes. Ethan counted at least 10, maybe more, weapons raised and tracking. His mind raced through options, finding nothing but variants of captured or dead. Then Soral stopped running. She turned to face the approaching guards, her blades singing free, and Ethan saw something in her posture that made his chest tighten. Resignation mixed with determination, the set of someone who decided the only way out was through. "When I engage," she said quietly, "you run northeast. There's a communications tower 2 kilometers out. Get a message to your Dr. Silva." "Not happening." "Ethan," she looked at him, and for the first time he saw fear beneath the discipline. Not fear of death, but fear of what dying here would mean. Evidence buried, conspiracy uncovered by no one, their species' collusion continuing uninterrupted. One of us has to survive. Then we both do. The guards closed in, weapons trained, voices shouting commands in multiple languages. Ethan moved beside Soral, his hands empty but ready, his body angled to protect her flank the same way she was angled to protect his. Her skin shifted again, colors he'd never seen, burgundy bleeding into something that might have been vulnerability or might have been something else entirely. She didn't tell him to leave again. The first guard reached for Ethan, trying to separate them, and that's when everything went wrong. Or right, depending on perspective. Ethan broke the guard's arm in 2 places before anyone could react. The fight lasted 90 seconds. Ethan moved through the guards like something unleashed, his fists and elbows finding targets with brutal efficiency. He'd been trained for fieldwork in hostile territories, taught how to disable threats without killing when possible. But the line between restraint and survival was thin, and he walked it with grim focus. A guard swung a rifle stock at his head, and he caught it mid-swing, twisted, drove his knee into the man's midsection hard enough to lift him off the ground. Soral fought beside him with lethal grace, her blade moving in arcs that left guards bleeding and disarmed. But she kept glancing at Ethan, her movements fractionally slower than they should be, her attention divided. He saw her skin shifting through colors too rapidly to track, burgundy and crimson and something darker, her entire body betraying the emotional chaos beneath trained discipline. Then reinforcements arrived. Stun nets deployed from launchers, crackling with electrical current. One caught Ethan across the shoulders and his nervous system locked up, muscles seizing as he hit the ground. Through the haze of pain, he saw Soral spin toward him, saw the calculation in her eyes as she weighed escape against staying, saw the moment discipline lost to something else entirely. She didn't run. The second net took her down 3 meters from where he lay convulsing. Ethan woke in a cell that smelled of disinfectant and recycled air. His wrists were bound with restraints designed for something stronger than human baseline, and his chest ached where the stun net had burned through the medical gel Soral had applied. He tested the restraints carefully, finding no give, then surveyed his surroundings with methodical attention. White walls, reinforced door, observation camera in the upper corner, medical equipment along one wall, the kind used for invasive procedures. His stomach turned. The door opened and 3 people entered, 2 humans in corporate security uniforms and 1 Kethran male whose bearings suggested military authority. The Kethran was older than Soral, his crimson skin marked with scars that told stories of decades in combat. His horns were thicker, darker, and his eyes held the flat assessment of someone who'd stopped seeing other beings as anything beyond tactical elements. "Dr. Kovac," the Kethran said, his voice carrying harmonics of contempt. "Your physical capabilities are remarkable for your species. We'd like to understand how a human without enhancement managed to kill 3 guards and injure 7 others." Ethan said nothing, his jaw set. The human guards shifted uncomfortably, hands near their weapons. "Your companion has been detained separately," the Kethran continued. "She will face significant consequences for compromising her mission parameters. Emotional attachment to a human subject is considered evidence of psychological instability among my people." The words hit harder than the stun net. Ethan felt rage coil in his chest, hot and immediate, but forced it down into something cold and useful. He met the Kethran's eyes and smiled without humor. "Where is she?" "That's not your concern." "Then we don't have anything to discuss." The interrogation lasted 4 hours by his estimate, though without windows it was hard to judge. They wanted to know about his training, his genetic background, whether he'd received unauthorized enhancements. They took blood samples, tissue samples, scanned his bone density and muscle structure with equipment that hummed against his skin. Through it all, Ethan refused to cooperate beyond the minimum necessary to avoid outright torture, his mind occupied with one repeating thought. Where was Soral? When they finally left him alone, secured to an examination table with monitoring equipment invading his body, he stared at the ceiling and thought about her hand on his shoulder in the cave, the warmth of her skin, the way her colors had shifted when she'd touched his wounds. The fear in her eyes when the guards closed in, not fear of capture but fear of him being hurt, of something happening to him. He'd seen that look before, on his mother's face when he'd come home bleeding from fights, on Dr. Silva's face when he'd taken assignments to dangerous worlds. The look of someone who cared whether you lived or died. The door burst open with enough force to bend the frame. Soral came through like violence given form, her blade wet with blood she hadn't bothered to clean. 2 guards lay unconscious in the corridor behind her, their armor dented in ways that suggested her fists had done as much damage as her weapon. Her skin was nearly black with emotion, colors roiling across her arms and face, and her eyes found his with an intensity that made breathing difficult. She reached his side in 3 strides, her hands fumbling with the restraints in a way that contradicted every efficient movement he'd seen from her before. Her fingers shook. She was breathing too fast, harmonics in her voice rising to something almost painful when she spoke. "Did they hurt you?" "I'm okay," he managed. The restraints clicked free and he pushed himself upright, ignoring the pull of adhesive where monitoring leads tore from his skin. "Soral, what?" She grabbed his wrists and pulled him down until their foreheads touched, her breath hot against his face. Her eyes were too close to focus on properly, green, bright, and wild, and he felt the vibration of her voice through skin contact before he heard the words. "I killed 4 guards getting to you," she said. "I broke protocol. I abandoned my duty. I don't care." His hands found her face, fingers tracing the darker markings along her cheekbones. Her skin was fever-warm, shifting through shades under his touch, and he realized with sudden clarity that she was terrified. Not of consequences or punishment, but of what she was feeling, of the loss of control she'd spent a lifetime learning to maintain. "I didn't break," he told her, his voice rough. "Kept thinking about you, about your hand on my shoulder, about the way you look at me like I'm not what you expected, but maybe what you wanted anyway." Her colors deepened further, burgundy washing into something that looked almost violet in the harsh laboratory light. When she kissed him, it was with the force of something too long denied, her mouth against his, carrying desperation and relief, and the kind of raw honesty he'd never experienced from anyone who wasn't human. He kissed her back with equal intensity, tasting blood and fear and the beginning of something that felt inevitable. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she pressed her palm flat against his chest, where his heart hammered against his ribs. "We need to move," she said. "They're coming." "Did you find the data cores?" Her expression shifted, warrior focus cutting through the emotional chaos. "Yes, the conspiracy goes deeper than territorial disputes. They're harvesting genetic material from multiple species, including humans, specifically targeting traits like aggression, protective instinct, pain tolerance." She met his eyes. "You were never here to investigate. You were here to be studied." The implications settled over him like cold water. Silva wouldn't have sent me into that. Then someone intercepted your assignment. Soral pulled him toward the door, her grip on his wrist unbreakable. "We need to get this evidence out before they can erase it." "But Ethan..." She stopped, turned to face him fully. "Once we do this, there's no going back. Your people will question why you survived when others didn't. My people will strip me of rank for emotional compromise. We'll be evidence of the conspiracy simply by existing together." He looked at her standing there, blood-spattered and fierce, and more honest than anyone he'd ever known, her hand holding his like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go. His chest ached with something that had nothing to do with injuries. "Then we'd better make it count," he said. They ran. The facility was designed for containment, but Soral knew weak points that shouldn't have been common knowledge, and Ethan's strength opened doors that should have held against standard breaching protocols. They moved as a unit, his power and her precision combining into something more effective than either could achieve alone. Guards fell or fled, alarms screamed, and somewhere in the chaos, a Kethran voice was shouting orders that might have been about them or might have been about damage control. They reached the communications hub at the facility's center, a room filled with equipment sophisticated enough to punch signals through atmospheric interference and across systems. Soral accessed the data cores, while Ethan held the entrance, his bloodied hands wrapped around a rifle he'd taken from an unconscious guard. "How long?" he called. 2 minutes for upload, 3 if their encryption is stronger than expected. Behind them, footsteps approached at a run. Multiple contacts, organized formation, weapons hot. Ethan counted at least 8 distinct patterns, maybe more overlapping. His finger found the trigger guard, and he felt the familiar sickness of knowing he might have to kill. The door exploded inward. Kess came through first, his blade already singing toward Ethan's throat. Ethan fired twice, center mass, but the Kethran was already moving and the rounds went wide. He dropped the rifle and caught Kess's wrist mid-strike, redirecting the blade into the door frame where it buried deep enough to send vibrations up both their arms. "Soral," Kess called over Ethan's shoulder, his voice carrying harmonics of disgust. "Stand down. You're only proving what they'll say about you, that emotional contamination has made you unfit for service." Ethan drove his elbow into Kess's face and felt cartilage break. Behind him, Soral's fingers flew across the console, her breathing too fast, urgency thrumming through every second that passed. 90 seconds, she said. Kess's operatives spread into the room, weapons raised. 4 of them, human and Kethran both, moving to flank Soral's position. Ethan broke away from Kess and threw himself between them and her, taking a rifle stock to his ribs that sent pain lancing through his chest. His vision grayed, but he stayed upright, stayed between them and her, because that was the only thing that mattered. 60 seconds, Soral said, her voice tight. Ethan grabbed the nearest operative and used him as a shield when another opened fire, the man's body jerking with impacts meant for Ethan's chest. He dropped the corpse and surged forward, his fists finding targets with desperate efficiency. Every second he bought was another second closer to transmission, another second closer to making this matter. Kess engaged him directly, blade moving with lethal precision. The blade opened a line across his shoulder, then another along his ribs, blood hot against skin already slick with sweat. 30 seconds. Soral abandoned the console and launched herself at the operatives flanking Ethan's position. Her blade carved through armor and flesh with purpose, and Ethan saw something in her face he'd never seen before. Not calculation or discipline, but fury channeled into focus. She was fighting for something beyond duty, fighting with the kind of commitment that only came when you had something worth protecting. Kes saw it too. His expression shifted from contempt to something darker. "You've become weak," he told her, his blade moving toward Ethan with lethal intent. "Emotional attachment is a disease among our people, and you're infected." "Wrong," Soral said, and there was something in her voice that made even Kes pause. "I've become strong." She moved between Kes and Ethan with speed that defied tracking, her blade meeting his in a clash that sent sparks across the floor. They fought with the intensity of shared history, but Ethan saw the difference immediately. Soral was fighting with emotion channeled into focus, and it made her faster than calculation alone ever could. Kes wounded her, his blade slicing across her thigh deep enough to stagger her. She dropped to one knee, breathing hard, and Ethan felt something break open in his chest. The sound that came out of him wasn't human, wasn't rational, was pure protective rage given voice. He went through the remaining operatives like a storm, breaking bones and crushing windpipes with hands that shook with adrenaline and fear, and the absolute certainty that he would die before letting anyone hurt her again. One tried to stop him, and Ethan lifted him off the ground and threw him into the wall hard enough to crack the reinforced material. The console chimed. "Transmission complete," Soral said, her voice carrying relief and pain in equal measure. "It's done." Kes lunged for the console, trying to terminate the broadcast, but Soral was already triggering the facility's emergency evacuation. Alarms shrieked through the compound, automated systems activating to clear personnel. In the chaos, Kes made a choice: pursue them or try to salvage the operation. He chose survival. Soral leaned heavily on Ethan as they moved through corridors filling with panicked workers and automated lockdowns. Her leg left a trail of blood behind them, burgundy on white floors, and her skin had gone pale crimson with blood loss. He half carried her toward the transport bay, his own wounds forgotten in the face of her labored breathing. "Stay with me," he said, his voice rough. "Soral, stay with me." "Not going anywhere." But her words were slurring, harmonics fading. "Got what we came for." They reached the transport bay, and Ethan loaded Soral into the nearest shuttle, his hands leaving bloody prints on clean metal. He initiated launch with protocols he barely remembered from basic training, and the shuttle lifted away from Tannis 7's surface as the facility descended into chaos behind them. Soral's hand found his, her grip weak but insistent. He looked down at her, sprawled across the co-pilot's seat, blood soaking through makeshift bandages, her skin cycling through colors that spoke of pain and exhaustion, and something else he was almost afraid to name. "Ethan," she said, and her voice carried undertones he was learning to interpret. "I need you to know something. Tell me later after we get you to medical." "Now." She pulled him closer with strength that shouldn't have been possible given her condition. "Before everything gets complicated." He knelt beside her seat, his hand cradling her face, thumb tracing the darker markings along her cheekbone. Her eyes were bright green against crimson skin gone pale, and he'd never seen anything more beautiful or more terrifying than her looking at him like this. "You redefined what strength means to me," she said. "Watching you care so openly, so completely without fear of judgment. Watching you choose violence to protect rather than dominate. Watching you be vulnerable and powerful at the same time." Her colors shifted again, burgundy washing through crimson like emotion made visible. "My people taught me that control and emotion were opposites. You showed me they're not. That feeling deeply makes you stronger, not weaker, when you choose how to channel it." "Soral," I refused to go back to what I was before. Her grip on his hand tightened. "Before you, before this, I refuse to pretend I don't feel." He kissed her then, gentle despite the urgency thrumming through his veins, careful of her injuries and the exhaustion etched into every line of her body. She kissed him back with what strength she had left, her free hand tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, despite the pain it must have caused. When they broke apart, she was smiling, It transformed her face, made her look younger and more alive than discipline ever had. "Get me to medical," she said. "We have testimony to give." The nearest facility was a colony station 3 hours out. Ethan pushed the shuttle harder than safety parameters recommended, his hands steady on controls while his mind raced through everything that would come next. Investigation, interrogation, questions about how a xenobiologist and a Kethran scout had survived what trained operatives couldn't, suspicion from both their peoples about the nature of their partnership. He glanced at Saral, her eyes closed now but breathing steady, her hand still holding his between their seats. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. That was the only certainty he had. Dr. Silva met them at the medical bay, her face tight with relief and concern. She supervised Saral's transfer to emergency care, while firing questions at Ethan that he answered mechanically. His attention divided between words and the medical team working on Saral beyond the observation glass. "You should be checked too," Silva said, eyeing the blood soaking his clothes. The surgery took 4 hours. When they finally let him into recovery, Saral was pale crimson against white sheets, monitors tracking vitals that were stable but fragile. He pulled a chair beside her bed and took her hand carefully, mindful of the IV lines and sensors. Her skin was cooler than normal, colors muted, but when her eyes opened, they found his immediately. "Still here," she said, her voice weak but carrying those familiar harmonics. "Always." The weeks that followed were exactly as complicated as he'd anticipated. Testimony before multiple councils, depositions that lasted days, questions about their relationship phrased as concern but carrying undertones of suspicion. Kethran officials who looked at Saral with disappointment, human officials who looked at Ethan like he was evidence of something they didn't understand. Through it all, they stayed together, learning each other in the spaces between interrogations, navigating the reality that Saral's emotional expressiveness was considered aberrant by her people, that Ethan's physical capabilities raised questions about human potential that made governments nervous, finding that the space between their differences was exactly where understanding lived. Months later, when the trials concluded and the conspiracy's architects faced justice, they stood on the observation deck of a transport heading toward the frontier colonies. Saral's leg had healed, leaving a scar she wore without shame. Ethan's chest bore marks from claws and blades that told their own story. "They'll always see us as evidence," Saral said, watching stars slide past the viewport. "Proof that our species can work together, or proof that emotional compromise is dangerous, depends on who's asking." "Let them look." Ethan's arm curved around her waist, pulling her against his side. "We know what we are." She turned in his embrace, her hands framing his face, her colors shifting through shades of burgundy and crimson that he'd learned meant contentment and desire and the kind of deep affection her people didn't have words for. When she kissed him, it was unhurried, thorough, carrying all the certainty they'd built together through danger and choice and the deliberate act of understanding across difference. "What are we?" she asked against his mouth. "Strong enough to be vulnerable, different enough to be whole." He smiled, tracing the darker markings along her jaw. "Human and Kethran, and something neither of our peoples has language for yet." Her answering smile was worth every scar, every question, every moment of doubt that had brought them here. Outside the viewport, the frontier waited. New worlds, new dangers, new possibilities for people brave enough to reach across the gulf of what made them alien and find connection in the space between. They'd be brave enough, together,